The black Mercedes came out of nowhere, tires screaming against wet pavement as it barreled toward the 7-year-old girl skipping down the Brooklyn sidewalk. Sarah Miller had exactly 3 seconds to make an impossible choice: abandon her 6-month undercover mission or watch Dante Rossi's daughter die in front of her. Without hesitation, she launched herself forward, her body colliding with Mia's tiny frame as 800 pounds of German steel slammed into them both. The sickening crunch of metal meeting flesh echoed through the quiet residential street. But the man standing frozen on his mansion steps wasn't just any father watching his child nearly die. He was the most feared Mafia boss in Brooklyn. And what he discovered about his daughter's nanny in the hospital that night would change everything he thought he knew about loyalty, love, and the woman who had just saved his world. Stay with me until the end, because this story will prove that sometimes the most dangerous lies are told by the people who risk everything to protect you. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe and comment where you're watching from. Now let's get into it. It's a grey Thursday morning in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, March 2024, and the Rossi estate sits behind 15-foot iron gates like a fortress carved from brownstone and marble. Inside the sprawling mansion, crystal chandeliers cast warm light over Persian rugs worth more than most people's homes, while original Monet paintings watch silently from walls that have heard more secrets than a priest's confessional. This wasn't just any wealthy family's home. This was the domain of Dante Rossi, the man who controlled every port, every truck route, and every significant business deal that moved through Brooklyn's waterfront. Every morning at exactly 7:30, Dante would sit in his mahogany-paneled office, reviewing reports that came in code through encrypted phones. Territory disputes were settled with surgical precision. Protection payments arrived like clockwork from restaurants, shipping companies, and construction sites that understood the value of his family's friendship. Politicians took his calls. Federal judges reconsidered their verdicts when his name came up in legal conversations. Rival families from Queens to Staten Island knew better than to cross into Brooklyn without permission. Yet for all his power over the criminal underworld, Dante Rossi had one weakness that kept him awake at 3 in the morning: his daughter Mia, 7 years old, with dark curls that bounced when she laughed, and brown eyes that saw the world as a playground, designed specifically for her amusement. She was everything good that remained in Dante's increasingly dark world, the single ray of light that reminded him he had once been capable of love instead of just fear, which was exactly why he had been so careful about finding the right nanny. After Mia's mother died in that car accident 3 years ago, Dante had interviewed 47 candidates before settling on Sarah Miller. 28 years old, early childhood education degree from NYU, grew up in Ohio with no family connections to organized crime, and most importantly, she made Mia laugh in ways that echoed through the mansion's marble halls like music. Sarah had been with them for 6 months now, and Dante had to admit she was perfect for the job. She arrived every morning at 6:45, always 15 minutes early. She spoke to Mia in gentle tones that never carried the nervous edge most people developed around the Rossi household. She planned educational activities that somehow made learning feel like play. She even made decent coffee, which was more than could be said for the previous 3 nannies who had quit after discovering exactly who their employer really was. What Dante didn't know was that Sarah Miller's education credentials were completely fabricated. Her real name was Special Agent Sarah Chen, and she had spent the last 18 months training for this specific assignment. The FBI had been trying to build a case against the Rossi organization for 7 years, but Dante's security was impenetrable. No wiretaps worked because he never spoke business on phones. No undercover agents could get close because he trusted no one outside his immediate circle. But then intelligence discovered his one soft spot. His daughter needed a caregiver, and that caregiver would have access to the house, the conversations, and most importantly, the office where Dante kept financial records that could link him to 15 different federal crimes. The plan had been brilliant in its simplicity. Agent Chen would pose as the innocent nanny, document evidence of Dante's criminal activities, and build the case that would finally bring down Brooklyn's most untouchable crime family. She had been told to expect 6 to 8 months of placement before gathering enough evidence for indictments. What the FBI hadn't counted on was how completely Sarah would fall in love with the little girl she was supposed to use as cover. Mia Rossi wasn't just some criminal's daughter who happened to need supervision. She was a bright, funny, incredibly kind child who drew pictures for Sarah every Friday, who insisted on making breakfast together every Saturday morning, who cried during sad movies and cheered during happy ones, with the pure emotional honesty that only 7-year-olds possessed. And what Sarah definitely hadn't expected was how Dante would look at her sometimes when he thought she wasn't paying attention. Not with the cold calculation she had been trained to recognize in criminal subjects, but with something that looked almost like gratitude, appreciation for the way she made his daughter smile, relief that Mia had someone who genuinely cared about her well-being rather than just another employee going through the motions. But today, 6 months and 13 days into her assignment, Agent Sarah Chen was about to discover that some choices transcend every rule, every mission, and every carefully constructed lie. She was walking Mia home from St. Francis Elementary School, their usual Thursday afternoon routine that involved stopping at Carmine's bakery for cannoli and listening to Mia chatter about her day. The little girl was excited about an art project involving butterflies and kept skipping ahead on the sidewalk, her purple backpack bouncing against her shoulders, as she pointed out interesting dogs, colorful graffiti, and her reflection in store windows. Sarah was mentally reviewing the contents of Dante's office filing cabinet, which she had finally managed to photograph the night before, while he was at a business meeting. The financial documents she had found would be enough to prove money laundering through 17 different legitimate businesses. Her handler would be thrilled. The case could be wrapped up within weeks, which was when the black Mercedes came around the corner, going 40 miles per hour in a 25 zone, heading straight for the little girl who had stopped to pet a neighborhood cat. Time slowed to the kind of crystalline focus that usually only happened in life-or-death situations. Sarah saw the car's tinted windows. She saw the way it accelerated instead of braking when Mia stepped into the crosswalk. She saw the driver's masked face through the windshield and understood with absolute certainty that this wasn't an accident. Someone was trying to kidnap Dante Rossi's daughter, and they were willing to kill anyone who got in their way. Sarah had exactly 3 seconds to make a choice that would define the rest of her life. She could step aside, let the kidnapping happen, and maintain her cover for the greater good of the federal case she had spent 6 months building. Or she could do what every instinct in her body was screaming at her to do, and protect the child she had come to love like her own daughter. The choice was never really a choice at all. Sarah launched herself forward with every ounce of strength she possessed, her arms wrapping around Mia's small body as they both tumbled away from the car's original trajectory. But the Mercedes driver compensated, turning hard left to follow their movement. Sarah felt the brutal impact as German steel met human flesh, felt her ribs crack as she used her own body as a shield between Mia and 800 pounds of moving metal. Pain exploded through her left leg as the car's front bumper shattered her femur. Agony shot through her spine as they hit the pavement together, Sarah's body absorbing most of the impact, while Mia rolled safely into the gap between 2 parked cars. The Mercedes kept going, its engine roaring as it disappeared around the next corner, but Sarah barely noticed. All her attention was focused on the little girl beneath her. "Mia?" Sarah whispered, tasting blood. "Baby, are you okay?" "I think so," Mia replied in a tiny, shaking voice. "But you're hurt. You're bleeding a lot." Sarah looked down and saw that Mia was right. Her white blouse was rapidly turning red, and her left leg was bent at an angle that definitely wasn't natural. But Mia was alive, conscious, moving all her fingers and toes. That was all that mattered. From somewhere that felt very far away, Sarah heard running footsteps, shouting voices, and the distinctive sound of Dante Rossi's voice cutting through the chaos with deadly calm precision. He must have seen the whole thing from his office window, must have watched his daughter nearly die, and his employee sacrifice herself to prevent it. The next few minutes passed in a haze of sirens, paramedics, and Dante's surprisingly gentle hands checking Mia for injuries, while keeping a constant eye on Sarah's condition. She heard him making phone calls in rapid Italian, coordinating with what she assumed was his private security team to lock down the neighborhood and hunt for the Mercedes. But what struck her most was the way he looked at her as the paramedics loaded her onto a stretcher, not with suspicion or calculation, but with something that looked like awe, as if he couldn't quite believe what he had witnessed, as if he was seeing her clearly for the first time. "You saved her," he said quietly, his hand briefly touching Sarah's shoulder as the ambulance doors closed. "I will never forget this." Through the morphine haze, Sarah realized that everything had just changed. Her cover might be intact, but her mission had become infinitely more complicated, because she hadn't just saved Mia out of professional duty or strategic calculation. She had saved her because she loved that little girl, and from the look in Dante's eyes, he understood exactly what that meant. You see, Dante Rossi hadn't always been the cold, calculating mafia boss that Brooklyn feared. Once upon a time, he had been a different man. A man who understood what it meant to love someone more than life itself and lose everything that mattered in a single moment. 15 years earlier, Dante had been married to a woman named Isabella Castellano. She was the daughter of a respected family from the old country. But more than that, she was the one person who could make Dante laugh at his own intensity, who could soften the edges that his father's brutal training had sharpened into weapons. They had met at a cousin's wedding in Palermo, and Dante knew within 10 minutes of conversation that she was going to change his life forever. Isabella hadn't cared about his family's reputation or the shadow of violence that followed them everywhere. She saw something in Dante that even he had forgotten existed: kindness, humor, a capacity for tenderness that his father had tried to beat out of him during a childhood spent learning that emotion was weakness, and weakness got you killed. For 3 beautiful years, they built a life together that felt almost normal despite the ugliness of his business. Isabella ran a small art gallery in Little Italy. Dante kept his work completely separate from their home life. They talked about starting a family, about maybe moving somewhere quieter when Dante could figure out how to leave the organization without ending up dead in the Hudson River. But those dreams were destroyed one night when Dante's uncle decided that his nephew was getting too soft, too distracted by love to be effective as an enforcer. Uncle Salvatore didn't target Dante directly. That would have caused a family war that nobody wanted. Instead, he hired men from outside the organization to send a message that loyalty to the family came before everything else, including wives who asked too many questions about late-night phone calls and cash-filled briefcases. Dante came home from a meeting to find his world torn apart. Isabella, his future, his heart, everything that had made him human was gone in an instant, leaving only a note that said this was what happened to men who forgot their priorities. The investigation went nowhere. The police asked questions they already knew they'd never get answers to, and Dante learned the hardest lesson of his life. In his world, love was a liability that could be exploited by anyone ruthless enough to target it. From that night forward, Dante Rossi built walls around his heart that no one could penetrate. He became ruthless because ruthlessness was survival. He became feared because fear was respect. And he became alone because alone meant no one else could be used against him. For 15 years, those walls had held firm. No amount of pleading, threatening, or bribing had ever made Dante Rossi show mercy when mercy wasn't profitable. He had ordered hits on men who begged for their lives. He had foreclosed on businesses while owners wept at his feet. He had sent fathers to prison while their children cried in courtrooms. But then Mia had been born, and everything changed again. She was Isabella's legacy, the only good thing that remained from those 3 beautiful years. And somehow, despite his determination to stay emotionally disconnected, Dante found himself completely helpless against his daughter's innocent love. Mia didn't know her father was feared throughout Brooklyn. She only knew he made funny voices when reading bedtime stories, helped with homework math problems, and always remembered to cut the crusts off her sandwiches. To her, he wasn't a criminal. He was just her daddy who worked in an office and sometimes had important phone calls. Which was exactly why watching Sarah throw herself in front of a moving car to protect Mia hit Dante harder than any bullet ever could. For 6 months, he had observed Sarah's interactions with his daughter, looking for signs of ulterior motives, hidden agendas, or the kind of calculation that marked most people who entered their orbit. Instead, he had witnessed genuine affection, protective instinct, and the kind of selfless love that his own mother had shown him before cancer took her away when he was 12. But now, looking at this woman who had sacrificed her own safety without a moment's hesitation to protect his child, those walls began to crack. Because Sarah's choice in that crucial moment had revealed something Dante thought no longer existed in his world. Someone who valued Mia's life more than their own survival, and that changed everything. At Mount Sinai Hospital, Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness for 18 hours, while surgeons reconstructed her shattered femur and repaired internal bleeding that had nearly killed her. During those long hours, Dante Rossi did something he hadn't done in 15 years. He prayed. Not to the God of his childhood who had seemed to abandon him when Isabella died, but to whatever force in the universe decided who lived and who died, who deserved second chances, and who had used up all their luck. He bargained with fate itself, promising anything, everything, if Sarah would just survive long enough for him to properly thank her for what she had done. Mia sat beside him in the hospital waiting room, her small hand clutched in his much larger one, asking every few minutes when Miss Sarah would wake up and whether she was going to be okay. Dante found himself giving reassurances he wasn't sure he believed, making promises about recovery and healing that he had no authority to make. But what concerned him most wasn't Sarah's physical injuries. It was the investigation that would inevitably follow this attack. Someone had tried to kidnap his daughter in broad daylight on a public street. That wasn't random violence or opportunistic crime. That was warfare. And warfare meant someone had decided the Rossi family was vulnerable enough to attack directly. By the time Sarah's eyes finally opened 43 hours after the accident, Dante had identified 17 possible enemies, with both motive and resources to organize a kidnapping attempt. His security team had reviewed every traffic camera within 6 blocks of the incident, and he had made the decision that would define the next phase of his relationship with the woman who had saved his daughter's life. He was going to find out everything there was to know about Sarah Miller, every detail of her background, every relationship she had maintained, every potential connection that might explain why someone would target her along with Mia. Not because he suspected her of betrayal, but because he needed to understand how to protect her from whatever enemies might come next. What Dante didn't know was that Sarah's FBI handlers were conducting their own investigation. The attack on Dante's daughter represented a massive complication in their carefully planned operation. Agent Chen's cover had held during the incident, but her emotional response to protecting the child raised serious questions about her continued objectivity in the case. Special Agent Marcus Webb sat in his downtown Manhattan office, reviewing security footage of the Mercedes attack and wondering if his best undercover operative had been compromised by exactly the kind of emotional attachment they had trained her to avoid. The way she had thrown herself in front of that car wasn't tactical, it wasn't strategic. It was pure maternal instinct protecting a child she loved, which meant Agent Sarah Chen might no longer be capable of completing the mission she had spent 6 months building toward. And that created a problem that had no easy solutions. When Sarah finally regained full consciousness, the first face she saw was Mia's, pressed close to the hospital bed, with tears streaming down her cheeks, and a construction paper card covered in drawings of butterflies. "You scared me," Mia whispered. "I thought you might die like Mommy did." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, reminding her of exactly what this little girl had already lost and why her protective instincts had overridden every other consideration in that crucial moment. She reached out with her uninjured hand to touch Mia's face. "I'm not going anywhere, sweetheart. I promise." It was a promise she had no authority to make, given that her real identity would eventually be discovered and her assignment would end regardless of her personal feelings. But looking into Mia's frightened eyes, Sarah knew she meant every word with a sincerity that surprised even her. From somewhere beyond her limited field of vision, she heard Dante's voice speaking quietly into a phone, arranging for additional security and expressing gratitude to what sounded like a medical team. When he finally appeared beside Mia, his expression carried a complexity that Sarah had never seen before. Relief mixed with concern, gratitude blended with something that looked almost like guilt. "How are you feeling?" he asked, and there was a gentleness in his tone that she had only heard him use with Mia. Like I got hit by a car, Sarah replied, attempting humor despite the morphine fog clouding her thoughts. But Mia's okay, so everything else is manageable. Dante's dark eyes searched her face as if looking for something specific. What you did yesterday. No one else would have made that choice. You could have been killed. Sarah met his gaze steadily, despite the pain medication making it difficult to focus. She's worth it. You know that better than anyone. Something shifted in Dante's expression, a softening that made him look younger and more vulnerable than she had ever witnessed. For just a moment, the feared crime boss disappeared, replaced by a father who understood exactly what Sarah had risked and why. I owe you a debt, he said quietly. Everything I have, everything I am, belongs to you now. It was the kind of old-world declaration that carried weight beyond simple gratitude. In Dante's culture, a blood debt meant lifetime obligation, protection, and loyalty that transcended normal business relationships. Sarah realized he was offering her something that very few people in his world ever received: his complete trust, which made her FBI assignment infinitely more complicated than it had ever been before. Over the following week, as Sarah recovered in a private room that Dante had arranged and paid for, she found herself caught between two worlds that were becoming harder to separate. During the day, Mia would visit with schoolwork that needed help and stories about classroom adventures that required detailed discussion. Dante would stop by every evening after his business meetings, sometimes bringing flowers, sometimes bringing reports about the ongoing investigation into the attack, always asking about her comfort and recovery progress. But at night, alone with her thoughts and the knowledge that she was living a lie that grew more complicated with each passing day, Sarah would stare at the ceiling and wonder how much longer she could maintain a deception that was beginning to feel like self-betrayal. Her FBI handler visited twice, posing as a friend from Ohio, to check on her physical recovery and assess her mental state regarding the mission. Agent Webb's concerns were evident in every carefully worded question about her attachment to the family and her continued ability to gather intelligence objectively. "You're getting too close," he warned during his second visit. "The way you protected that child, the way you're looking at this assignment. I need to know you can still complete the job." Sarah understood his concern, but she also understood something that Webb couldn't grasp from his position outside the situation. The job had evolved beyond simple evidence gathering. She wasn't just documenting Dante Rossi's crimes anymore. She was protecting a little girl who had already lost one parent and who trusted Sarah completely. She was earning the respect and gratitude of a man who had never shown vulnerability to anyone. And somewhere in the complex emotional mathematics of the situation, she was falling in love with both of them in ways that made the FBI mission feel less like justice and more like betrayal. 2 weeks after the hospital discharge, while Sarah was still recovering at the Rossi mansion and learning to walk with a cast that would remain for another month, Dante's investigation into the kidnapping attempt finally yielded results. The black Mercedes had been traced to a rental company with connections to the Torino family from Staten Island. Security footage from the rental location showed Carlos Torino himself signing the paperwork under a false name. The Torinos had been trying to muscle in on Brooklyn port operations for 3 years, testing Dante's defenses and looking for weaknesses they could exploit to gain territorial advantage. Apparently, they had decided that targeting his daughter would be the most effective way to distract him from business operations, while demonstrating that even his family wasn't untouchable. They had been wrong about the distraction part. Instead of weakening Dante's focus, the attack had sharpened his resolve into something approaching pure vengeance. Sarah was in Mia's bedroom, helping with a science project about solar systems, when she heard the phone calls that would change everything. Through the partly open door, she could hear Dante speaking rapid Italian to what sounded like multiple people, his tone carrying the kind of cold authority that made it clear he wasn't discussing business investments or shipping schedules. What followed was 3 days of carefully orchestrated retaliation that reminded everyone in Brooklyn exactly why Dante Rossi had survived in his business longer than men who were supposedly more ruthless. Carlos Torino's primary enforcement crew was arrested on federal weapons charges, after anonymous tips led police to discover illegal firearms in their cars during routine traffic stops. The Torino family's most profitable restaurants suddenly found themselves failing health inspections and losing their liquor licenses due to unexpected regulatory scrutiny. And Carlos himself discovered that his personal financial information had somehow been leaked to the IRS, prompting an audit that would tie up his assets for months. No violence, no obvious retaliation, just the systematic destruction of everything the Torinos had built in Brooklyn, accomplished through legal channels and bureaucratic pressure that couldn't be traced back to the Rossi organization. Sarah watched this demonstration of power from inside the mansion, simultaneously impressed by Dante's strategic thinking and reminded of exactly what kind of man she was dealing with. He might show gentleness with his daughter and gratitude toward her, but he was still capable of destroying his enemies with surgical precision when they threatened his family, which made her final decision inevitable. 3 weeks after the attack, Sarah received a message from Agent Webb requesting an urgent meeting at their usual location. She knew what he was going to ask before she left the house. The investigation had stalled long enough. The FBI needed the evidence she had gathered, and they needed her to plant the additional surveillance equipment that would allow them to monitor Dante's ongoing activities. But sitting across from Webb in a coffee shop in downtown Brooklyn, looking at photographs of the filing cabinet documents she had copied, and listening to detailed plans for Dante's eventual arrest, Sarah realized that everything had changed for her in ways that couldn't be undone. "You have enough to arrest him," she said quietly. "The money laundering evidence is solid. Why do you need more?" "Because we want the entire organization," Webb replied. "Not just Dante, but his lieutenants, his financial network, his political connections. You're our only inside access to information that comprehensive. And what happens to Mia when you arrest her father?" The question hung between them like a challenge. Webb's expression made it clear that collateral damage considerations weren't part of his mission parameters. "That's not your concern, Agent Chen. Your concern is completing the assignment you've spent 6 months building toward." Sarah looked out the coffee shop window at the Brooklyn street where she had nearly died protecting a 7-year-old girl who trusted her completely, where Dante had knelt beside her broken body and promised that he would never forget what she had sacrificed for his family. "I need more time," she said finally. Webb's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Time for what?" "To make sure Mia is protected when this all comes down. She's an innocent child who's already lost one parent. I won't be responsible for destroying her entire world without ensuring she has someone to take care of her." It wasn't entirely a lie, but it wasn't entirely the truth either. Sarah did care about Mia's welfare more than any FBI protocol demanded. But she also cared about Dante in ways that made the prospect of betraying him feel like self-destruction. Webb studied her face for a long moment before responding. 2 more weeks, Agent Chen. Then we move forward with or without your cooperation." That evening, Sarah sat in Mia's bedroom, reading stories about brave princesses and magical kingdoms, while her mind raced through possibilities that all seemed to lead toward impossible choices. She could complete her FBI mission and destroy the only real family she had ever known. She could abandon the case and face federal charges for dereliction of duty, or she could find a third option that somehow protected everyone she had come to love, while still serving the cause of justice she had dedicated her career to pursuing. When Dante appeared in the doorway to say goodnight to his daughter, Sarah looked up at his face and realized that the choice had already been made, not by her rational mind or her professional training, but by her heart, which had decided weeks ago where her true loyalties lay. Some decisions transcend duty, career, and even self-preservation. Some choices can only be made by people who understand that love is worth any sacrifice, any risk, any consequence that follows. And looking at the man who had offered her his complete trust and the little girl who had taught her what unconditional love felt like, Sarah finally understood what she was going to do. The confrontation came exactly 2 weeks later, on a cold Tuesday evening in March that felt like the first day of Sarah's new life. She had requested one final meeting with Agent Webb, this time in his downtown Manhattan office where they could speak freely about classified federal operations and the career that was about to end for one of them. Webb sat behind his government-issue desk, reviewing the surveillance equipment Sarah was supposed to install in Dante's home office and the legal paperwork that would authorize wiretaps once the devices were operational. The case against the Rossi organization was finally reaching the climax that years of investigation had built toward. What he didn't know was that Sarah had spent the previous 48 hours making copies of every federal document related to the operation. Financial records, surveillance reports, planned arrest warrants, even the personal files of FBI agents assigned to the case. Information that would be incredibly valuable to someone who needed to prepare for federal raids while protecting innocent family members from collateral damage. "I can't do it," Sarah said quietly, her hands folded in her lap as she faced the man who had trained her, trusted her, and built his career advancement around her successful infiltration of Brooklyn's most untouchable crime family. Webb's expression shifted from mild annoyance to serious concern. "Can't do what specifically, Agent Chen? I can't betray the people who saved my life. I can't destroy a little girl's world. I can't arrest a man who trusted me with everything he values most." The office fell silent except for the distant sound of Manhattan traffic 30 floors below. Webb studied Sarah's face as if seeing her clearly for the first time, recognizing that the woman sitting across from him was no longer the disciplined federal agent he had trained for this assignment. "You're in love with him," Webb said finally, his tone carrying the kind of disappointment usually reserved for massive professional betrayals. "I'm in love with both of them," Sarah replied honestly. "The father and the daughter. The family I was supposed to infiltrate became the family I would die to protect." Webb reached for his phone, probably to call security or initiate whatever protocol existed for dealing with agents who refused direct orders during active operations. But Sarah had anticipated this moment. "Before you make that call, Agent Webb, you should know that I've already made my choice. Every file related to this operation, every surveillance report, every planned arrest warrant is currently being delivered to Dante Rossi by messenger. He'll know about the federal case against him within the hour." The phone slipped from Webb's hand as the implications hit him. A 6-month undercover operation destroyed. Years of investigation wasted. Multiple federal agencies embarrassed. And his most promising agent revealed as a double agent who had chosen love over law. "You've destroyed your career," he whispered. "You'll face federal charges for obstruction of justice, accessory after the fact, maybe even treason." Sarah stood up slowly, her healing leg still tender, but supporting her weight as she prepared to walk out of the FBI office for the last time. "I know. But I also know that some things matter more than careers. Some people matter more than cases. And sometimes the right choice is the one that destroys everything you thought you wanted." She paused at the door, looking back at the man who had shaped her professional identity for 4 years of federal service. "Take care of yourself, Agent Webb. And remember that justice isn't always about sending people to prison. Sometimes it's about protecting the people who can't protect themselves." By the time federal agents arrived at the Rossi mansion 3 hours later, with search warrants and arrest orders, they found only an empty house, carefully cleaned of any evidence, and a note thanking them for their interest in Brooklyn real estate, but explaining that the family had decided to relocate to a warmer climate for health reasons. Dante, Mia, and their former nanny had disappeared into the kind of witness protection program that money and criminal connections could purchase when federal protection wasn't available. They had become a family that existed outside the law, beyond the reach of both organized crime enemies and federal investigations. 6 months later, in a small coastal town in North Carolina, where nobody asked questions about accents or wondered why a 7-year-old girl called her father's girlfriend by her first name instead of Mommy, Sarah Miller watched Mia build sandcastles on the beach, while Dante grilled fish they had caught that morning from a boat he was still learning how to operate. The FBI had closed the Rossi case as unsolvable after suspects and witnesses vanished, without leaving forwarding addresses. Agent Webb had been transferred to a desk job reviewing financial crimes that didn't require undercover work or complicated emotional decisions, and 3 federal prosecutors had quietly decided that pursuing charges against suspects who no longer existed might not be the best use of government resources. The city whispered about the night the Mafia boss and his family disappeared, taking with them secrets worth millions of dollars, and leaving behind only rumors about FBI operations gone wrong and agents who chose love over loyalty to the Bureau. But Mia knew the truth that the adults had missed entirely. Sarah hadn't destroyed a federal investigation by falling in love with criminals. She had saved a family by choosing to become part of it. She had proven that sometimes the most dangerous lies are told by the people who risk everything to protect you from the truth. Sometimes the strongest people aren't the ones who follow orders without question. Sometimes they're the ones who jump in front of moving cars to save children they love, who sacrifice careers for families they've chosen, who understand that real loyalty means protecting people over protecting systems. Thanks for watching, and remember to subscribe for more incredible true stories that prove family isn't always about blood, but it's always about choice.